Hey there. In my class, I sometimes ask students to memorize a sonnet and stand in front of the class and recite it from memory. It's a very intense experience that often unnerves a lot of students. But I will tell you that over the many years I've been doing this is the #1 sonnet that students memorize. And there's a variety of reasons for it. It's Time Does Not Bring Relief by Edna Statements of Milay. I think students memorize it, one, because it is kind of easy to memorize. The rhyme scheme is in-stopped lines, and one of the first things you discover when you learn the difference between in-stopped and in-jammed lines is that in-stopped are much easier to memorize and write than in-jammed lines. So this poem is fairly traditional in that it has in-stopped lines. Also, I think a lot of, I do teach majority girls in my class, a lot of them relate to the poem because for once it's a woman speaker rather than a male speaker, as we see in a lot of traditional sonnets. And two, reason number three, it's just sad. And I think a lot of us just like sad things. We like to listen to sad songs, and I think that teenage years are filled with a lot of angst, and even though I don't think many teenagers have maybe reached the level of emotional pitch that the speaker of this poem has, I think that they kind of feel that way even if they haven't had an external equivalence to it yet. Edna Statements of Milay was a Greenwich Village poet from New York, and tremendously talented, and she loved sonnets, and she wrote a lot of them, and they were all sort of like really powerful emotional statements. This one is the voice of a woman who has lost someone she loves, and it's not just a breakup, it's got to be death, because the loss is absolutely permanent in a way that I think is beyond a breakup. We look at the poem, and we want to know, is it Shakespearean or Petrarchan? And we can see, I can almost just read the first 8 lines, and I can see that it has an ABBA rhyme scheme. And since it's an ABBA rhyme scheme, I'm pretty sure that it is Petrarchan, at least in structure. That's not the Shakespearean rhyme scheme. We see that there's punctuation at the end of almost every line, and that seems very traditional too, sort of like Shakespeare. I think that the octave is pretty much a good way of dividing the poem. Like there's what I would call a subtle volta right here, but there isn't a strong like but or yet or something. Instead, there's what I would call a change of tone and a change of approach to the topic. But it opens with declaration, like a lot of sonnets do, a lot of Emily Dickinson poems do too, where you just declare a fact, something to be true. And here, she says very strongly that time does not bring relief. And what she's talking about is that she's lost somebody she loves, let's just say a husband or a lover, and somebody well-meaning but misinformed has said what you shouldn't say to somebody who's in deep grief, that, give it some time, and time heals all things. I'm not saying that's not true. I do think that there's a great deal of truth in that statement, but you just don't say it because it's indelicate. You just you weep with those who are weeping, right? But she has been told this, and she basically, it's a poem written in opposition. Her audience is someone who told her that, and she's going to tell them while they're wrong. She says, time does not bring relief. You all have lied who told me time would ease me of my pain. I miss him in the weeping of the rain. I want him in the shrinking of the tide. Let's just stop right there. It opens with an accusation. She speaks to the you and tells them that you lied to me. We do want to acknowledge that this is a love poem, a poem of lost love, and a poem about time and love reminds us of those great English Renaissance subjects that we see in a lot of their poetry. Notice that we have parallelism and repetition here, where she restates how miserable she feels. She says, I miss him in the weeping of the tide. The weeping of the rain. Notice that she uses the word weeping, right? We pay attention to that. The rain is personified as if it had emotions and it's crying. And we also see that, that she didn't have to say the word weeping. That's always interesting, right? She could have said, I miss him in the falling of the rain. But she said weeping because that word is so much more suggestive. I want him at the shrinking of the tide. The tide is going away from her. These are both water images that maybe are echoes of tears in some ways that sort of add to the feeling of the whole poem. And we see maybe a little more water imagery here as we move into the next quatrain, since they are kind of nice in-stopped lines. I want you to notice that it begins with anger, and then it's sort of like it's slowing down as the poem goes on. She has in the next quatrain what I would call imagery of change, because the whole world is moving on, but she is not. And I think that's often what is most troublesome, right? I tell my students sometimes that it's not the day of the funeral that's so terrible, it's coming home from the funeral and life going on. The next day, in some ways, is more painful than the actual day, because you realize that you have to keep going, and sometimes we just don't. We want the whole world to stop and grieve. So let's look at some imagery of change. She says, the old snows melt from every mountainside. And we see that she is a decorative poet. She likes alliteration, she likes imagery, kind of traditional like Shakespearean. The snow has melted, and last year's leaves are smoke in every lane. I'm just underlining the alliteration so you can see how beautiful it is. But people used to rake up their yards and burn the leaves. And I love that instant transformation. The leaves have turned to smoke. The snow has turned to water that goes into the rivers from the mountainside. This almost makes us want to make a volta right here, right? Because she's contrasting how everything in the world is continuing to go on and change, but last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart, and my old thoughts abide. I love the H and H, heaped on my heart. For some reason, the stack of leaves that are heavy makes me think of the heaviness that's weighing on her heart, and I think that's sort of an incredible, powerful image there. So it's mostly lament, right? This is a poem of lamentation, a poem of loss and sorrow. And she's trying to express to us how she feels about that sorrow. If there's a volta, it seems strange to say there's a volta here without a mark of it, like a but or yet. But it does seem like she becomes circumspect. She steps back, and she tries to explain to the people who told her time would bring relief what her situation is. Like, you don't understand what it's like to be me in my sorrow. She says, she presents that there are two places in the world she can go, and what it feels like to go either of those places. She says, there are 100 places where I fear to go, so with his memory they brim. So one place you can go is places that she's been with her lost husband or lover. And she doesn't like going there because it makes her think about him, and that makes her feel sorrowful. I'm very fond of the word brim, like the brim of a cup, the idea that it overflows with memories of this guy. She fears to go 100 places because they brim with his memories. So you can't go to places they've been, and then paradoxically, you can't go to places they haven't been. And entering with relief. Notice that's relief echoing the top of the poem, time does not bring relief. And entering with relief some quiet place where never fell his foot or shone his face, I say, there is no memory of him here, and so stand stricken, so remembering him. It ends in a terrible paralysis, and I don't know why I have a fondness for poems that end in paralysis. There's many of them I could list for you here. We see that a lot of alliteration, him here, stand stricken, so remembering him. Just put it all together though. I can't go to places we've been because they remind me of him. I can't go to places where we haven't been because when I walk in those places I think, he would have loved this. And so everything reminds her of her lost lover or husband, places they've been, places they've never been. She can't escape her grief, and she's trapped within it forever. The poem begins in anger and ends in paralyzed despair or sorrow, or maybe even a sort of acceptance that this grief will never pass. The most important word might be relief, because she's looking for it and has denied it as the poem goes on. And as I mentioned before, the poem is a poem of lamentation and loss, but complicated by anger as well. Remember that when we look at a poem, we never need to be simple about its tone. We need to always be complex. So it's anger mixed with sorrow, which many times in my experience are two sides of the same coin.